Welcome. I'm Bernice Ross, the CEO and President of BrokerageUpandRealEstateCoach.com, and I'm delighted to have Joe Rand with me. He is one of my favorite people in the business and one of the most successful. He is an author. He's the Chief Creative Officer for Better Homes and Gardens Rand Realty. They're based in the New York and New Jersey area with 27 offices, $2.5 billion in sales. I think Joe knows something about how to, create a great customer experience and also be highly profitable. Thank you for being with us, Joe.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, the reason I wanted to interview you is, first of all, you have this wonderful new book called How to Be a Great Real Estate Agent. I really loved it. I highly recommend it. Get it, buy it. Good book, a lot of great information in there. But the part I want to hone in on today, there are two pieces. First of all, you base your business, the book is based upon, the title says Principles of Client-Oriented Real Estate. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to talk about the general concept, and then we're going to hone in on how to have a great customer experience. So, Joe, tell me, what does CORE stand for, and what are the principles that are included in CORE?
Okay. CORE stands for Client-Oriented Real Estate, C-O-R-E, and just a clever acronym, I guess, for trying to articulate the perspective that a lot of times when we talk about the industry, we talk about it being, there was a time when it was broker centric, and then it was a time when it was agent centric, and people still talk about it as if it's agent centric. And my position is that about 15, 20 years ago, the industry started to shift to become more client centric. And because client centric real estate led to a very bad acronym, I changed it to client oriented real estate. But the idea is that our industry needs to be much more focused on the needs of a client, what they need. And for too long, I think we've been, what's best for the agent. And I think we still have to value the agents. The agents are the workforce. But I think that one of the reasons the industry, I think, has a little bit of trouble right now is that we've lost sight of the fact that the ultimate end user of our product are buyers and sellers, and we need to do a better job to give them a better experience.
I couldn't agree with you more. So, for me, my entire career, I started with a company where the client experience was paramount. Our broker wanted his people to be the most professional, the most educated, and whether you had a $50,000 transaction or $50 million transaction, they got the same level of service, which was the very best that we could. And we pioneered the concierge process back in the early 90s for the industry, where you can get all these services through your broker, which is was a great experience. So let's talk about how to create a great customer experience. So you outlined 10 steps, Joe. The first one is detail. Now that's a hard one for most of us. Don't bother me with the details. I get somebody else. Can I give it to the transaction coordinator or to an assistant?
Yeah. Well, I think that, the 10 elements of the great client experience is really all about trying to focus yourself on delivering on the elements. I got these elements from, a lot of research into client service in other areas, hospitality and retail and things like that. So, detail, attention to detail. One of the things that I think that we do very badly in this industry, and part of it is the fact that we come from this independent contractor tradition whereby a broker does not feel comfortable enforcing standards on agents. And so what you end up with is a lot of brokerages shy away from establishing protocols of how you should do things. You go to a Starbucks, you go to a Ritz-Carlton, there are enforced standards about how you treat the client. But if you run a brokerage, I'm not in the living room when they give a pitch. I'm not in the car when they're taking a buyer out. I don't get to see what they do the way that if I ran a restaurant, I can watch over my entire work staff. And so it's really up to the agent to be able to pay attention to detail, and it's up to the broker to be a little more aggressive in helping the agent to be able to focus on those things. So, for example, in our company, we're very checklist oriented. So when you take a listing, there's a checklist of all the things you have to do, and it's supposed to help you to not miss details, not screw up on getting the sign ordered or something like that, because that's what happens when you wing it. When you wing it, you end up with trouble. And people notice the details. They seize on the little things if they're not right, as a way of coloring their entire experience.
That is certainly, that's such a great observation, because they get caught on the details. But the other thing that you've just described, this checklist approach, broker I worked at, you had to have everything on the checklist because it's the only way you would get your commission check. It was a good way to keep the agents over the barrel and get them to perform. But more importantly, that actually justifies why you are entitled to a full commission when they start seeing how much you have to do to close.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Now,
yeah, you have to show. That's one of the things I always tell the agents. I say, show them the checklist.
yes,
Like, show them how much stuff has to happen.
Yes, practice. Listen, he's right.
Because
Listen
they think that it's easy. They think that it's like, oh, you take the listing and you put it in. Well, there's like 30 different discrete elements that you have to satisfy to make sure that listing goes in correctly. And I think that we don't show our work enough to clients. There's a certain amount of under the hood that they don't see what actually goes on. And that, I think, undermines our relationship with our clients, because if they don't see us working, they don't think that we're doing enough to earn the commission.
And that's exactly right. Let's go on to number 2, consistency.
Yeah, it's the same. It really comes from the same wellspring that, I can have somebody walk. It's really tough in real estate to enforce consistency because of that independent contractor issue, that I can have somebody walk into one of my offices today at 2:00 and they're buying a home and they get, whoever is up at that time to be able to handle a walk-in. And then somebody else can walk into an office 3 miles down the road, get somebody else. And those two people can have two completely different experiences, because no matter what I do as a broker, even though those agents have access to the same program, same training, same resources, same tools, same back office, same everything, it's that last link in the chain, which is the agent performance, that it really determines what that experience is going to be. And again, I'm not in that living room. I'm not in that car. I don't get to monitor that. And so it's very frustrating because it's very tough to maintain that consistency. And so it's that same sort of process. You try to create consistency and attention to detail by setting out standards as a broker that as part of your supervisory responsibility, as part of your licensing responsibility, that you're allowed to enforce. You shouldn't shy away from it just because you're an independent contractor model, that you're allowed to, under terms of your licensing, make sure that the client has an experience that lives up to the fiduciary responsibilities that you probably have to them.
Well, one of the great ways to check that, of course, you've got the checklist, which is great. And then the post-closing survey, that kind of holds their feet to the fire. And when they know they're going to get rated, it's also, for brokers listening, this is also a very important risk management tool. Now, number 3, I love enthusiasm.
Yeah, rah,
How do you stay cranked up in this business without being on adrenaline and, motivated, make it, pick yourself up when things go wrong?
Listen, we all know this in our heads, that, your attitude is, you control it, you can determine it. It's just tough. Some mornings, some days, it's tough to get yourself into that mode. But, one of the things that I find interesting about enthusiasm is that sometimes enthusiasm is such a superficial, but highly available and noticeable element of the service experience, that sometimes it can hide all manner of sins. And also, I think we overvalue it to some extent. That we've all been to a restaurant. I think I use this example in the book. We've all been to a restaurant where the waiter comes over, the server comes over and is like, here's my name, and can I get you anything? And they're so excited, and you're like, it's infectious. And then your water doesn't get refilled and they bring you the wrong soup and whatever. They're not good at their job. They just were enthusiastic about their job. Enthusiasm to me is one of those things that's necessary to be good at your job, but isn't sufficient, because you also have to have the skills and the expertise to be able to do what you need to do. But I don't think any of it happens without you really being passionate and enthusiastic about your job. And I think that I see that a lot. I think most agents are enthusiastic when they're working with clients. I think that the part of the job they dislike the most is the lead generation aspect of it. But, when they have a buyer and they like taking buyers out, they like showing houses, they like the work that goes into trying to market a listing, they like that. And I think they're mostly enthusiastic about it.
Well, what you've just cited is number 4, essentially. It's, enthusiasm alone is not enough. You also have to have expertise.
Yeah. And this is, obviously expertise is one of those necessary things. And it's one of those things that in any enterprise, any job you have, you need to know your stuff. You need to know what it is you're selling. You need to know how to sell it, all that kind of stuff. But you know what I think is, I think it's really hard. I think that we don't give agents enough credit for how difficult their jobs are. That we make them, one of the themes of my first book, Disruptors, Discounters, and Doubters, is that we treat agents like they're salespeople, like all they need to do is to do lead generation, but they actually have to provide the service. They don't just lead generate and then hand off the client to a service team. They do the showings, they do the marketing, they do all that stuff, and then they negotiate the transaction and manage the transaction to closing. That's a lot of different types of skills they need to have. They need to have the skills of service. They need to have the skills of sales. And then think about when we talk about expertise, think about the inventory that they have to maintain knowledge about. That, you go to a car dealer, that car salesperson has 5 models of cars and they haven't changed in, 3 years. They're all the same. You get an agent, and that agent, there's 50 homes that come on the market every day that they have to be on top of. And if they, God forbid, they go and take a buyer out and they didn't find one of the high ranches that buyer found on her own, you'll lose that buyer because they think that you're not on top of the market. That, I think, is really tough. And I think it's, for a job that it takes, in New York, 80 hours of education to get your license. And for a job that you too often you see people say, oh, she'd be a great real estate agent because she's perky and a people person. The job is so hard. It's a hard job, and we don't do enough to educate them. It's a business, and it's a big, complicated business.
Yeah, and people don't realize that. Oh, you just put your sign out in front. That's why the checklists are so valuable. Mm-hmm. So let's go on to talk about connection. How to encourage agents to build connection with their clients.
The personal connection that you have to have with a client. Again, true about any enterprise, any kind of business, is you have to establish that personal relationship. And I think to some extent, again, it's really difficult sometimes for agents to do that, because the perception that agents are salespeople puts people on their guard. We've all seen it. You're at an open house, someone comes in the open house, you go to introduce yourself, and the person scurries away like you have a communicable disease, like you're going to force them to buy a house before they're ready. They get scared about that sort of thing. And we have the same thing. You sit down with a seller and you've got you've knocked out a brilliant CMA. You have all the comps. There's absolutely no doubt this house is worth $350. And you say, well, this is, and you're going to give them a price opinion at around $350, which is what all the comps show. And they think that you're trying to underprice it because they're suspicious of you. And that's something you really have to overcome. And I think that what it requires you to do is to be really focused on that client. When I teach listing presentations, I don't teach them as a presentation. I teach them as a consultation. That the first thing you do is ask questions, not talk about yourself, not talk about your 23-point marketing plan, not talk about your broker. Go in the way a doctor goes in, or a financial planner, or a lawyer, or even, stuff, not the white collar stuff, like a blue collar stuff, like what a plumber does or what a hairstylist does. What's your problem? How can I fix it? That's what we should be doing. And when we're so focused on ourselves, it's difficult to make that connection. You make that connection by being focused on the other person and what they need.
All I want to say is I'm cheering for you as you're saying this, because I stopped training listening presentations back in the 80s and went to the notion of a listening consultation, where your job. Yeah, and that's exactly, and gee, you've got a $2.5 billion company that you've built on that concept. That's a huge, huge takeaway for anybody who's listening to this. Let's talk a little bit about communication. People today, especially our younger people, they really want to communicate through texting and Instagram and other things, but a lot of times that's not great for real estate. How do you work through those issues around communication between different generations and their clients?
I think there's a generational issue to some extent. You have to really determine when you want to give a great service experience, you got to figure out, what does that person want. You have to be as conversant and have the ability to be able to communicate by phone, in person, over text message. And then I think some of these more esoteric things, like as we were setting up this appointment, we did it through Facebook Messenger, which I rarely use for communication, but it happened to be the way that we started to talk about this, doing this discussion. And like you said, there's so many different ways to communicate now, and I think it makes it even harder it's so difficult on the agent or really anybody in business these days because you have to attend to so many different channels. You go back. I mean, I go back in this business. I don't know how long you go back. I go back to well before the internet, when the inventory came in. Yeah, I think we're probably in that same boat. But I remember one of my first jobs in real estate in the '80s, working at my mom's company, was helping people maintain the shoebox of inventory that would come in. The inventory would come in little index cards, and the agents kept them in shoeboxes organized by location price. And my job was to update them every week when the new cards came in.
LA at least had an MLS book.
Yeah, well, no, the MLS book, I will say, the MLS book, this is like 84, 85. I'm dating myself now, but the book used to have the updates. There was a sheet that had all the updates, but the new listing.
They send you got the book, and then you got the daily updates,
The daily updates, yeah. And you would get a phone call, and then you would call them back. And if they weren't there, you would leave a message with the secretary. And if the secretary wasn't there, you just call back the next day. Like there was no, one of the things that's so funny about communication media is how quickly they get corrupted. When we first got answering machines, we were excited because we didn't want to miss messages. Like we got them specifically. It was so exciting to come home and see the light blinking and, oh my God, let me press the button. Let me see what my messages are. And now, voicemail's a chore. Email, when it first started, people were thrilled to get emails. Now email's a chore. These things, what happens is they get inundated by, really by salespeople like us that we see the sales, they're paying attention to their email. Let's email them. I think we're going to start seeing that happen more with text messaging. I'm starting to get a lot more text message marketing messages than I used to, because people know that that's the one channel that most people attend to really carefully, as opposed to their email, which they open up with the delete button poised. And so I think communication's tough. And again, client-oriented real estate. Find out how the client wants to be communicated with.
Number one question you should ask about communication when you first start working with a client: how do you want me to communicate with you? Spot on.
And who do you want me to communicate with? Because sometimes, one person is going to take the lead, and sometimes they really want you to bring both of them. If it's a couple, you have to have three-way calling to get all of them in the same conversation.
So let's go on to talk about generosity. And This one's near and dear to my heart. I like to call it give to get marketing. I think that's kind of what you're on here. But tell me, what do you mean when you say generosity?
I think generosity is the idea that you're willing to give something without getting something in the near term. One of the foundations of the program that's outlined in the book is all about treating non-transactional clients like clients. Like someone bought a house from you last year. You don't think of them as a client anymore because they're not buying or selling, but you should think of them as they're still a client of yours. They just don't need to buy a home today. And we shouldn't define clients as people, only those who need to buy or sell a home, because the reason we're defining those people as clients is that's when we get paid. But there's a lot of services they need even when they're not really customarily willing to pay for them. And you have to be willing to be generous to do that kind of stuff for them. Send them mailings that aren't just marketing, but are informational market reports. We do market reports. We collect all the events in a community. We send them out on mailings to say, hey, here's what's going on the next couple, this seasonal. We do it every season. So here's what's coming up this spring. We're right now putting the finishing touches on our summer guide. And we have somebody whose job it is to go and collect all these things and to find out where every fireworks display is, when it is, and write it all up, and then we send it out to all the clients in the middle of June. We're not getting paid for any of that, but it's about relationship building, and you have to be generous like that. People don't realize just how generous this industry is. They complain about the commission model, but when you call it a contingency instead of a commission, people realize, they think of it differently, and you realize I don't get paid a dime unless you actually close on a house. Every agent has had an experience working dozens, hundreds of hours with a client, and they didn't make $1 on it because the deal didn't close. The buyer didn't pull the trigger, deal fell apart, whatever else. We don't charge them by the hour, and I think that by itself is relatively generous.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Joe. I mean, this is such an important point. Let's talk a little bit about empowerment. What do you mean by empowerment?
Empowerment is the idea that people on the front line have to have a certain amount of authority to make decisions, that it can't be, you have such and I believe in rules and I believe in standards. And I mean, I think that we don't have enough of those in the industry, that that the agents have guidelines that they should follow. I think that's important, but I think you also have to have an agent workforce that is smart enough about when to make exceptions, when to bend the rules, when to do things differently, that they're empowered to make those kind of decisions. Like, we have certain internal commission standards in our company, but the agents have leeway with that in certain circumstances. Like, I mean, we pre-print the commission on our forms. We're allowed to do that, at least in some of our states. And where we can, we do, because we think it's important to set out what your standard is in writing. And the agents know they can cross it out if they need to, but at least they're establishing the standard, so they can make exceptions. And the one thing we don't really allow leeway on are regulatory issues, but anything that's a company policy, we have to allow a certain amount of wiggle room so the agents can in exigent circumstances, make the right decision.
Couldn't agree more. So this of course is one of the best predictors of both new agent and experienced agent success: resilience.
Oh yeah. Resilience is basically the idea that there's, no matter how good you are, now the best agents in the business have situations that go sideways, and I deal with them all because I'm the lawyer for the company. So if I talk to a client, that means that something's gone horribly, horribly wrong. The reason I've gotten called in is they went to the agent and the agent couldn't satisfy them, and they went to the manager and the manager couldn't do it, and the regional couldn't do it, and then it ends up on my lap. So I get the creme de la creme of the unhappy clients. And what I have discovered about resiliency is that it's never too late to save that relationship. That if people come to you and you say, all right, I understand you're not happy. Our job is to make you happy. So the details of what we did or didn't do that screwed up, that made you unhappy, is less important to me than what we have to do now to fix it. And if you fix it, here's what's interesting. When I ask people to give me their favorite stories of amazing client service, 95% of the time, it's about recovery. It's about resilience. It's about a situation that was awry and that got fixed, because that's memorable. You go to a restaurant and they screw up your order, but then they give you something free. You remember that they gave you something free. You go to the hotel and they lost your reservation, so they upgrade you to a better room. You remember that. A great service experience sometimes isn't memorable because nothing really happened. You just were happy, but it doesn't stand out, but a recovery stands out. So I always look upon these situations with an unhappy client as an opportunity to blow them away by exceeding their expectations of how we're going to fix the problem.
Well, that is so spot on. And this notion of fixing it, those are the magic words that Americans buy on. I want to wrap up today with the word delight. How can we delight our clients?
Delight is one of my favorite thing about all this, is that, great service experiences, what they really come down to is, did you do something that struck them as unexpectedly marvelous? It could be anything. It could be small, it could be big. Sometimes it's a minor thing. It's a thoughtful gift or a thoughtful gesture. I detail some examples in my book. Right at the beginning, I start by talking about like what makes great agent experiences, and doing the big things, getting the pricing right, and going above and beyond to try to find the right home for a buyer, and things like that. But I think that the best opportunities to create delight are situations where you think expansively about what service can I provide somebody. And I tell the story about a guy who used to buy rock salt at the first snow. He used to buy rock salt for all his favorite referral clients. He would buy a bag and then he would tie a little ribbon with a person on it and then drop it off at their house. And it was always like well received and it was nice. But then one day he did it and he gets a call back from one of his good, past clients who'd sent him a lot of referrals. And the guy explained how they'd had a terrible day. He and his wife had a terrible day. They'd been to the doctor. They got some bad news. They were all upset. They got in the car. They start driving home. They're kind of just in a bad state. And then it starts to snow. And he's like, oh, I got to drop my wife off and go out and get some rock salt. Like he's all bummed out about the fact that he can't even stay home with her to help, get through this moment. And then they come up and they see the rock salt on the front stoop, and they just break out. They just start crying because it was such the perfect gesture at the right moment. Now, he didn't know, like, that's the point. Delight can come out of nowhere. He didn't know he was going to have that kind of impact. It was just supposed to be a little single, a little gesture that's, oh, that was very thoughtful. It's going to snow and I get the rock salt. But it's when you do things like that all the time that you put yourself in the position for like a wonderful thing to happen. And that to me is so important, because if you're constantly looking out for other people, if you're constantly thinking expansively about what they need, you find yourself all the time in situations to do nice things for other people, right? Always. And then every once in a while, you hit a home run like that, where you make a meaningful difference in their lives.
Well, Joe, this is a great way to wrap up. What's your final takeaway for our viewers and listeners today?
I think that as an industry, we're just not attentive enough to not just think expansively about what people need, but then think creatively about how to give it to them. I mean, my title is Chief Creative Officer, and what I do is I try to come up with ways in which we can deliver better service experiences for our clients, and also deliver better tools for our agents to, because they're at the front lines of all this, and we have to empower them with the best stuff. And I think that as an industry, we need to be more creative. We need to, I hate to use the cliche, think outside the box, but we have to think, what is it people need and how can we give it to them? And look for those kinds of opportunities to expand our repertoire of the kinds of services we give. Because if we don't improve the consumer experience in real estate, somebody else will. Somebody from outside the industry will. And that's when we'll be in real trouble.
Well, Joe, what a great way to end, and what excellent words of advice throughout this. I can't believe how closely we're in line in terms of how we think about how the business needs to be conducted. So I'm doubly glad to have had this interview today. We've been visiting with Joe Rand. He's the Chief Creative Officer for Better Homes and Gardens Rand Realty. They're in the New York, New Jersey area. Joe, thank you for being with us today. This was a fantastic interview.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm such a big fan, so this was a real thrill for me.
And check out Joe's book, How to Be a Great Real Estate Agent.
Thank you so much. I love that. Thanks.
My pleasure.